emotional suppression has been so advantageous for so long, and you might not be aware of the consequences. And I can tell you, one of the consequences is an increased risk of heart disease. So that emotional suppression long-term increases your chance of heart disease and things like that. The masculine life is a war. It's a war for the woman that you want, the money that you want, the career. And if you aren't viewing it as a war, then you're losing. I do not view life and relationships as a war. 3 main reasons that teenage boys suppress their emotions are fear of judgment, fear of being seen as weak, and fear of being a burden.
Welcome to Triangle Theory, Brendan. Really nice to have you. I've been following your work for quite a bit now, a few months, I think, before I was reaching out to you. Initially, my friend Christian showed me your stuff, and I thought it's very interesting in what you do and what you researching, and I'm very looking forward to get into this.
Awesome, I am too.
Yeah, thank you for coming on, Brendan. It's my side too. When Conrad sort of showed me the stuff and what you're working on, I was very inspired, and I think there's definitely more of your work needed in this space. So yeah, super excited, and again, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks so much.
What led you to focus on emotions and young boys and men in general?
One way that I often start answering this question is I was a high school teacher near Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, where I live. And one of my favorite students, you're not supposed to have favorite students, but you have favorite students. He died from suicide in my second year. And so that was a really impactful experience where I was really close to him. And it made me kind of focus more on emotional mental health issues. I then did my master's in special education, but focused on students diagnosed with emotional and behavioral disorders. That's one of the categories in North America, and found out that 81% of students diagnosed with emotional and behavioral disorders are male. And I was like, oh, how come the disproportion? How much is biology? How much is socialization? I was a history teacher and a biology teacher prior to this. So I kind of always was curious about the biological piece and socialization piece. And yeah, I in hindsight, I think I had a bit of wishful thinking that I thought that emotionality would be like the silver bullet. Like if we could get increased emotional fluency, literacy, emotional intelligence, then there'd be less pain in the world, less boys and men in pain, less pain being caused. And I do think that is super important. But in my PhD research, I did find it's not the silver bullet for just solving anything. And I don't even know if silver bullets exist when we talk about these topics. But healthy emotionality is really important, but it's not the end all be all of these conversations.
What do you mean by healthy emotionality?
There's a researcher named Dr. Mark Brackett who has kind of made an acronym of so when I talk about emotional fluency, emotional literacy, is your ability in 5 skills, which goes to an acronym RULER. So your ability to recognize your emotions and other emotions, your ability to understand the cause and consequences of your emotions. And so what you mean by this is not if I'm angry, I punch something. That's not the cause and consequence we're talking about. We're talking about, okay, if you recognize that you're angry, is that a primary emotional response or a secondary emotional response? So a primary emotional response of anger is anger is an emotion that when something crosses our boundaries, that's a primary response of okay, something's wrong here. It's a great warning system that some boundary is being crossed. But more often, anger is a secondary emotion, and there's a first emotion that came up first, and anger is the secondary response to that first emotion. So for instance, a lot of the times it's shame, and shame is a feeling like I am bad or something's wrong with me inside. And so anger, for boys and men especially, can be a great strategic way to stop yourself from feeling shame, because anger tends to be more outward focused, and so you can kind of focus your anger outward rather than sit with maybe some level of shame that you might have. So your ability to understand that, like, oh, I'm angry right now, but was that because my boundary was crossed, or is it because I felt betrayed, disappointed, hurt, shame? That's a skill of emotional fluency and emotional literacy. Then the L is your ability to accurately label the emotion. And so this is why, like, words, when we use emotional literacy, is like, it's hard to regulate an emotion if you don't have words to describe it. So if you don't know the difference between frustrated and disappointed, the consequences for that might not be super severe. But if you don't know the difference between shame and embarrassed, or anger, rage, like so many men and boys I work with, they only know anger in the rage form, and they don't know the proper role of anger throughout it. So your ability to understand and label emotions. Then the E is your ability to express your emotions. And it doesn't mean you have to express your emotions all the time. In fact, the most healthy, adjusted people generally have like a handful of people that they can be emotionally expressive with. But one of those important people is yourself. Can you be honest about your emotional experiences within yourself? And like here, journaling is a great tool for that. And then the last R is regulate. Your ability to regulate your emotions so that's what I mean by emotional fluency. It would be like the hallmarks of emotional intelligence.
Hey guys, thank you so much for making it this far into the podcast. If you have any feedback, then please let us know, as we always want to make this podcast better. So hearing from you is always a pleasure. Please subscribe to all of our platforms, get involved at Triangle Theory. If you've got any comments, or if you want to share any topics that you think that me and Conrad would like to talk about, then please get involved. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much.
When you're looking at young males, is there like a age group that you look at where you're like, this is the most important part of their development before their emotions, or the way they regulate, or the way they label their emotions for the rest of their lives, and it gets harder? Is there sort of like an age group that you sort of can target for that?
There's two heightened time periods in boys' development when they're at an increased risk of disconnecting from their emotions. One is around age 5, and the other is around the transition to high school, so 13, 14, 15. And so the first one is a bit more subconscious, and the second one boys are a bit more aware of. For instance, in my PhD research, I compared the most emotionally expressive grade 12 boys to the least emotionally expressive grade 12 boys. And I thought when I interviewed the the least emotionally expressive, I thought I'd ask them like, how long have you been this way? Or like, I thought they would just say, oh, this is just who I am. I've always been this way. But none of them said that. They all remembered when and why they started to suppress their emotions. And their answers almost always fell between like the grade 6 and grade 9 range. So that's what I refer to as the second boy crisis. The first boy crisis around age 5, which I would actually say is around age 3 to 6, is when boys recognize that two emotions in particular are less acceptable for them to express because they're boys. And that's fear and sadness. And so there's lots of interesting research that parents are less likely to use emotional language when talking to their sons than to their daughters, especially about sad or scary events. And so once again, remember what I just said about the 5 hallmarks of emotional intelligence, is that if you are not hearing language around your sad experiences or your angry or your scared experiences, you have less language to understand what is going on with your emotions, and then you actually have less ability to regulate it. And they also do this fascinating research where they take baby and toddler boys and girls and put them in opposite gendered clothing, and then they watch how do adults respond to them differently. So if they think it's a girl versus if they think it's a boy, and parents or caregivers, when they think it's a boy, they're less likely to co-regulate and approach them. If they think it's a baby boy and that baby boy is upset, they're less likely to give care and calmness. They're more likely to speak in a harsher tone towards a boy being fussy. But remember, these aren't actually boys. They think they're boys. And what else is fascinating too, which is, it hurts both boys and girls in different ways, But when they think a baby girl is fussing, they tend to assume that that girl is anxious. When a baby boy is fussing, they tend to assume that that boy is angry. And so I would say that for a lot of boys and men, we have a distorted relationship with fear and sadness, but also with anger, because there's this tendency to think like, oh, if you're upset, you're angry. And like the only way we can be upset is if we're angry. And then it becomes like way more of just like a box of like, okay, you're angry. It's like, no, there's so much more to that anger. And we just don't get as much emotional training around that.
You mentioned that when you spoke with younger boys, they remembered the specific period when they started to become a bit more, when they started to suppress their emotions a bit more. What were the reasons of it?
Great question. 3 main reasons that teenage boys suppress their emotions. Tied for the first 2 are fear of judgment, fear of being seen as weak, and tied with that is fear of being a burden. So like they don't want to mess up other people's days. I would say parents' divorce was a common theme in my research, that like my parents are going through enough shit as it is. I don't want to add to their distress. I need to take care of my younger siblings. Just thinking it's selfish. Like I should be the shoulder to cry on, not crying on someone else's shoulder. So don't want to burden other people. And the boys themselves, I asked them afterwards, they thought that those first 2 pressures were connected to masculinity. The third reason they didn't think was connected to masculinity, but that was, I called it fear of future pain, meaning they had been emotionally close with someone in the past, but whether through death or like a best friend moving away suddenly, and it was kind of not, it wasn't like, they didn't have like good coaching around it, or like it's just all of a sudden my best friend moved away and I never saw them again. They're like, I don't want to get emotionally close to someone again because I know how painful it was the last time, and so I'm not going to get close again. So those are the 3 main reasons.
With obviously like the fear and sadness part, I mean, is there a way that, especially targeting boys of like 3 to 5, where you can start to bring those emotions out and sort of talking to them more clear? How is it sort of flip that and go, okay, let's make it a normal thing?
Absolutely, being aware of how you might talk differently to boys versus girls would be really important. Like emotions are a human experience, and being able to reflect back to children what their emotional experience is one of the best ways to teach boys and any kids emotional literacy and emotional intelligence. The other best way to teach that last R, which is regulation, is that adults need to be regulated. It's called co-regulation. So if adults in the room are regulated, that gives the kid the best chance of regulating their own emotions. And so it'd be important for parents to assess of like, oh, does my son's anger actually activate me more than my daughter's anger? And do I respond differently in that way? That would be important things to start with. But another thing to that question of like what to do or what become aware of that we need to address is it's fascinating and disheartening to hear the reasons why parents feel the need to sometimes suppress their son's emotions. Is that boys actually tend to be more emotionally expressive than girls are on average, but parents have a justified fear that society is going to penalize and bully boys harsher for showing more, whether we call them feminine emotions of fear and sadness. And so they often feel like, well, I need to kind of preemptively protect my son from the schooling world when he goes to school of what he might face. And so they're kind of like, in a sense, they're protecting him, but in a sense, they're also speeding up the process of the emotional disconnect. But I think there's a compassionate look of understanding like boys are more likely to get judged and and policed from their peers around being more feminine than girls are around being more masculine.
Do you think it's because there's sort of this still in society, we kind of label boys like more tribalistic. They sort of have I suppose there's a bit more of like a tendency that by suppressing boys' emotions, they're sort of getting ready for the harshness and sort of being men in the world that are sort of confronted by a bit more pressure and sort of this like leader, protector, and that sort of expectation from such a young age then allows them to sort of go, well, I have to suppress that then. Would you say that's still something very ongoing and very prevalent in society?
Absolutely. Every gender has their own double binds, and double binds are like, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. And what you just identified is definitely one that a lot of boys and men still experience, of like, be emotionally soft and vulnerable when you want to, but also be rugged, tough, stoic, the anchor in other settings. And that for sure is one of the mixed messages that boys receive. And this doesn't answer the why, but just observationally, the study of masculinities has existed since like 1981. And over that time frame of the last 40, 50 years, researchers have just noted that the messages given to girls has generally increased. Like, so the girl box has expanded during that time, of like, here's all the things girls can be. And it's just observed very clearly that like the boy box has stayed relatively similar that whole entire time.
How do you then go about connecting with your kid? And this is probably a bit more, it's a bit selfish question, but I have a 15-year-old, well, 16-year-old nephew now, and I've got 10-year-old niece. And I feel like when he was a bit younger, and both of them when they were younger, it was a lot easier for me to make stuff happen. Like, do you want to go play basketball? He's in. Do you want to do this? He's in. Do you want to play computer games? He's in. And it's really important for me to maintain that relationship with both of them. But I feel like as they grow older, and obviously me moving to Manchester didn't help, so now we quite separate, and the only way to really connect with both of them is just through messages. But even when I'm messaging, I just get one word replies, and I know it's not because he doesn't like me, it's just he doesn't know how to or maybe it's probably I don't know how to ask him questions, because I remember when I was 16, 15 years old, all I was interested in, my friends, like family members, wasn't really at the top of the list, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
Don't
they
get me
call
wrong,
that
I still
peer
love
orientation.
Yeah,
That, like,
exactly.
developmentally during that stage, they care more about their peers think than what their parents think.
Yeah, exactly. And then and I feel like people, when they were trying to talk to me, it wasn't it wasn't I wasn't interested in that. But I feel like it's not because I wasn't interested, it's more like that people didn't know how to approach it. But now I'm in the same shoes that my uncles and aunts were when I was at that age.
I
So
love that you named this dynamic, because that's one of the biggest pieces in a lot of this work, is all the teenage boys, even the most emotionally restricted ones in my PhD, they all wanted a bit more emotional connection with their male friends and with their fathers. But they all felt awkward, or they felt like they didn't know how, they didn't think anyone else wanted the same thing. So there's a bit of, like, I love that you said, like, it wasn't, you reflected on your own teenage experiences, being like, oh, I didn't really want to. But then you said, oh, it's not that I didn't want to. It's just like, I don't feel like they knew how to connect with me. And it does change things. And what I really don't like, and this is what society does with teenage boys, is that kind of the messaging is like, okay, you're going to lose your teenage son for a couple of years, and then don't worry, they'll come back. And so there's actually like more emotional distance, when all the research shows that they actually, like 80% of the teenage boys in my research wanted more emotional education in schools. That was their number one change they wanted in schools. They were more confused about their emotions than they were about girls, said one boy. But all that to say is, like, they want more emotional guidance, but this does become tricky. And and fathers too want more emotional connection with their sons, but they also feel awkward about it. And part of it is that it is going to be awkward, because if there isn't that continued space from the early years onwards, it's like things do shift, and there's going to be developmentally that they want more distance. So like an uncle actually might be more positioned than someone's own parent to speak to that son. And of course, like there's not a one size fits all. I'd love to just tell you this is what you should do, but you should try multiple things. And I would say that you should try to just name the dynamic, but never forcing them to talk about it. Like, so for instance, if you hear this podcast and be like, hey, I just want to let you know, like I was listening to a podcast and I heard that like one of the main reasons why teenage boys don't want to talk about others is they don't want to burden other people with their problems. Just want to let you know, like I would never feel that way. I won't lose sleep from what you, well, only say if it's true. But like, I just want you to know, I'm here for you. And like doing those constant check-ins, because, and also paying attention to when teenage boys say something as a joke, because this happens so regularly, is that adult men too, they say something serious but present it as a joke, in which, so that if their friends respond to it like it's a joke, then they can laugh it off and just pretend like they weren't serious about it. And so in other cultures, like there's a study in India where boys are prioritized and preferred over girls. They have more have a higher emotional maturity scores during their teenage years than girls do. And so I do want to just say, like, biology is not unimportant, but when we do talk about emotional literacy, like these are skills. Emotional intelligence is a skill to learn and to train. And what you said, one more thing, is that social emotional learning in the K to 7 years changes in the high school years, whereas it's not just about changing and like equipping them with the skills. Something shifts, and it's more about status. Do those teenage boys view learning about emotions as something that will help them with status? So for instance, is it being taught to them by someone that they respect? That becomes more important, whether they're actually going to integrate and learn those things, which, yeah.
Do you find like going to that men or young boys that have those role models, whether it be like an uncle or a father or like a dad's friend that they can look up to, it's easier for them to have those emotional connections? Would you say that there's quite a big importance to have male role models?
Undeniably, it's so important to have male role models.
Yeah.
But it's also undeniable that for the most part, the influence of those role models can get swallowed up by the influence of peers and the media. So like the three biggest influencers are, yes, fathers or father figures, their peers, and the media during the teenage years. And so there's just so many messages that boys are bombarded with. There's a recent survey done of American men that 48% of American men say that their online worlds are more fulfilling than their offline worlds. And so we have this, and so not all of it's bad. Like so many men feel connected, or boys feel connected online, but there's also this isolation that can absolutely occur, so much more loneliness. And a part of that loneliness is the sense of being emotionally disconnected from their peer groups. Like the only major difference between the most emotionally restricted and the least emotionally restricted teenage boys in my research, the main difference was the level of loneliness. And I don't want people to picture these emotionally restricted boys as just isolated with no friends. Most of them actually had more friends. Like they were like very popular, very sociable, but they didn't feel like anyone actually understood them or that they belonged. And this is Dr. Brene Brown's research. Talks about and found that the opposite of belonging is fitting in. And if you think back to the teenage years, so much is about fitting in. It's like, how do you posture? How do you kind of survive those high school years as best as possible? It's often about fitting in. But like, when do you get the chance to belong? And how many people in your life can you belong too. And so it is so important for boys, for anyone, to have those positive male role models that they feel like, oh, I feel seen by this person. I feel like, oh, I can trust them, and I do trust them.
Would you approach it differently with younger girls? So let's just say I'm checking in with my nephew, I'm allowing him to express himself. How would you do that with a younger girl?
The same skills would be important here, but like there's different gendered aspects. So like for girls socialization, I talked about the two boy crisis. The girl crisis is around the grade 5, grade 6. Girls tend to go through puberty more. That coincides with when they tend to get sexualized and objectified by the world at a much greater degree. But it's also when relational aggression spikes, especially amongst girl relationships. So that's colloquially just known as like drama, but relational aggression. And so there's generally in girls' socializations, like this is obviously very generalized, is that like chances are they haven't been disconnected from their emotional experience, that like not necessarily all of the areas of emotional intelligence that are important, but they would probably have a lot more comfortability with the emotional expression on average. And so you would maybe work on other things where like you can also get kind of tunnel vision where people think emotional expression, just being able to talk about your emotions, is emotional intelligence. And it's like, that's just one component. And you can actually be overly emotionally expressive and think, oh, I'm so emotionally attuned and all these other things. It's like you actually need a bit more emotional suppression isn't the right word, but in a sense, stoicism, or like Dr. Brene Brown calls this like emotional floodlighting, or where you like think that you're so emotionally intelligent, but you're just like vomiting all of these things, and it's not like you're not really regulating it, or there's so many different dynamics. I don't know if that answers your question fully.
Yeah, it kind of did. Interesting.
I just want to ask, sorry, when you think of a sort of emotional intelligence, what are the main? Because you're saying that for those they feel like they can be emotionally intelligent, but they could just be regurgitating something that they've either read somewhere or listened to something. Are there key pillars when you think about emotional intelligence that is emotional intelligence, so to speak?
Yeah, and I'll throw myself under the bus here, is that I thought like as a teenager, I was very like in touch with my emotions. Like I liked writing songs. I was okay crying about things. And I felt that I was actually like kind of superior, or I felt kind of different than my male peer group. And I found the exact same thing in the teenage boys who were the most emotionally expressive. But by grade 12, they were starting to realize, oh, I actually don't think, sure, it might look different than some of my male peers, but I actually am realizing that they have a lot more emotional rich lives as well. And so I think we also need to just pay attention to how personality impacts this. Like I am more emotionally expressive. I don't know. So let's just say I'm more emotionally expressive than the average male. I don't think every male needs to be as emotionally expressive as me. Like there's just different personality traits, but I do think we always need to challenge, like, are we just less emotionally expressive, or are we emotionally suppressing ourselves? And I would say that most men who claim they're being emotionally stoic, I would say you're actually being emotionally suppressive. I think emotional stoicism is actually a great thing from like the tradition, the philosophy behind it is actually quite aligned with emotional intelligence, but too often it's used as like a suppressing of emotions.
Hey guys, your feedback is very important. And no, this is not an advertisement. Actually, what I'm asking from you is to leave a comment below what you liked and most importantly, what you disliked about this episode, because we can improve on the next episodes and we can make a better content for you to listen. Give us also a topics you'd like to us talking about, and we can prepare, do your research and talk about it on the next episodes. Thank you. How do you know if you're suppressive? So let's just say I grew up in a household where no one really spoke about emotions, but that's just normal to me. But then once I hit 25, 26 years old, I realized that, well, I didn't realize, I think that's normal. And how do you know that you're suppressing and expressing?
I can, the one point you just raised there is like, you might not know at the time. Like, and I think that's one of the, what I think is one of the beautiful gifts about growth and living is your capacity to just reflect and be like constantly reassessing, like, hey, this worked for me for a time period, does it still work for me now? And like, so I've learned, we call these emotional ideologies. So like, what are the stories we've come to believe around emotions? And I never want to be shame based in this. It's like the stories that, like, you believe the story that this lack of emotions was normal. In my research, in some countries, like having boys receiving hugs from their parents is very abnormal. So like, it's like, okay, it's very normal to not get hugs. And now I've talked to some boys who are like, I'm craving someone to give me a hug, not in a sexualized way, but like, I just want a hug.
Yeah.
And so like, we're constantly updating and reassessing these different narratives we've come to believe around emotions. I would say a good rule of thumb, because in the research, we can actually monitor how long it takes. We can monitor some body signals of like when you get an emotional stimuli, to how it responds in your brain. And we can determine whether that's emotional suppression is a somewhat conscious decision. Like you're consciously choosing, like, oh, I'm getting an emotional stimuli and I'm choosing not to show that on my face. And that takes a couple milliseconds longer than emotional repression, which is when you're not even aware that you would be suppressing something. So we can kind of monitor it that way. And we do find that, yes, men tend to use emotional suppression more than girls, and women are. But then the other thing to be aware of, and sorry, I love the questions that you're asking, and sometimes I lose track of where I'm going. But the other thing to be aware of, or the rule of thumb, is emotional suppression would be like never giving yourself the chance to feel in your body what came up. So for instance, if you're in school, and I've lots of teenage boys said, like, when I started to emotionally suppress at school, I got bullied less. And so like, great, that's super advantageous. Like that makes so much sense that that worked for you. But if you then never have given yourself, like in your journal with a trusted other individual, or just in your own room, have you ever felt what that was like? Then that is a good sign that you're suppressing, because like we ultimately need to feel our feelings at some point. And so some people I think this is one of the hardest things to convince people about, is that emotional suppression has been so advantageous for so long, and you might not be aware of the consequences. And I can tell you, one of the consequences of emotional suppression throughout your life is an increased risk of heart disease. And this is not a correlational. This is actually, enough research has shown that it's causational. So that emotional suppression long term increases your chance of heart disease and things like that. But like, it makes sense in the context in which it arises. We just need to keep on challenging ourselves. Like, oh, am I suppressing my emotions? Have I ever let myself feel it? Or have I only just cognitively thought about it and I thought that was enough? Emotions are more complex because emotions don't just exist in our heads, they also exist in our bodies. And so we need that connection with our bodies as well.
When you think about emotional suppression, is it because that individual is feeling shame or fear of expressing their emotions in that way?
A million reasons. It could be every time you had an emotional response, it was just shut down because your parents were maxed out outside of their window of tolerance, we call it. And so maybe your healthy, developmentally normal emotional response was treated from your parents as maladaptive, and like there's no tolerance or no room for this. And so you were never shown and never allowed to experience what just normal emotions are. And so like, yeah, it could be shame. It could be you were punished anytime you had an emotional response that wasn't a desired one, because and like this is the challenge of parenting too. But like I always say, if I could wave a magic wand around the world regarding people's relationship with emotions, it would be to increase our ability to tolerate our own emotional distress and the emotional distress of others. So chances are your emotional distress was not tolerated very well. And then you learned quite adaptively to not express your emotions or to hide certain ones because that would cause more problems. And as a child, you want to maintain the relationship with the caregiver at all costs. And one of those costs is to deny your own emotional needs if your parent isn't kind of aware of what emotional needs you kind of need.
From your own research and obviously studying men and young boys, what do you feel a healthy masculinity look like? Not really in practice, but just day to day, really.
Yeah, I can't tell you like specifically this, and this, but I can tell you, I can describe it. I would say that a healthy masculinity would be anything that moves you away from performance towards presence. So things that connect us more to the moment, more aligned with our values, our integrity, that connect us to ourselves, our emotions, and to other people. Those are the traits that I would say like a healthy masculinity would bring us towards. So if they're adaptive for the moment and they can kind of make us feel more present as opposed to like escaping or yeah, like sorry, yeah, there's so many ways we can go about this. And in academia, there's this huge debate whether we should even be promoting positive or healthy masculinity or if it's just positive humanness. And I land on one side of the debate, but I understand all the arguments.
So you mentioned that healthy masculinity is kind of shifting from performance to presence. What would be a live example of it?
Yeah, great question. So, if you look at the research of like when do masculine beliefs become the most harmful, the quick answer for that is when they become rigid. And this is true for anything like cortisol, stress hormone, is actually super helpful and super great in certain contexts. But if it's prolonged in your system, if it's rigid and stuck there, then that starts eating away at your nervous system and creates a host of health issues. Same thing with masculinity. If it's rigid, that's when it becomes harmful. And there's three main beliefs that the more boys and men adhere to these beliefs rigidly leads to like so many much more poor outcomes for themselves and for those they're in relationships with. And that's the need to suppress emotions, the need to be hyper independent, and the need to be dominant. So an example of like I always get boys and men to defend these because like being hyper independent can be super advantageous. So in the moment, like I guess a healthy masculinity would be able to assess a situation and understand, oh, I can do this myself, and I'm going to do this myself, and also be able to assess, you know what, this is something that like I might be able to do myself, but actually I think it's going to be more helpful, and I'm like one of the best predictors of a long life and life satisfaction is having a community that you can rely upon, and so knowing when to rely upon a community and then ask for help would be something that makes you more present, something that connects you more to other people. So just knowing when to shift those flexible standards around masculinity, being less rigid would be more healthy.
And then just touching on the loneliness, because I feel like it's an interesting one now that I feel a lot more mature than when I was 16. Obviously, I had so many friends, but none of these friends were real. Whereas now I have less friends, but a lot more meaningful relationships. So, do you think there is a particular age where having those friendships like having lots of friends is better than being lonely, despite the fact that they are just meaningless?
I would be loath to say that like they're meaningless because like they're getting something out of it. They're getting some status, or they're getting a sense it's less lonely at certain times, and that is one of the biggest obstacles. That I had three categories of teenage boys in my research. Roughly, is that there was boys that they resisted the restrictive masculine messages, and then most of the boys I called reluctant adherers. They didn't like it, but they also felt stuck. And one of their main reasons for stuckness is that they felt if they were more emotionally expressive, they would lose all of their friends. And so, yeah, they weren't bonding closely with those friends. But I would also say that we're in this dynamic and situation where I am so confident that within that friend group, there is another boy that also wants more emotional closeness. And it's just creating a self-fulfilling cycle of disconnection. So I would say that there's potential within those circles. And I have seen it both ways. I have seen people move out of their peer group and then be isolated. And that was actually a move towards healing and health. And that was better for them. But I've also seen people that like had no friends, and then they went with, it wasn't like a friend group that they belonged into, but it still was better than the existential loneliness that they felt. So I can't conclusively say one or the other is better or not. You kind of have to look at the fruit of it. Like, is your friend group like actively problematic? Like, to what level of toxicity is that friend group, I guess?
So let's just say if they're quite toxic but still brings you laughs, it's still better than being lonely.
Well, but then here's the thing, is that I also work with a bunch of youth in Canada who have just left gangs. That's one of their main reasons for joining gangs. And these gangs are like very violent, very problematic. So in that situation, the one reason why they get into those gangs is because of like the connection that they feel. It's this faux family when they have a complicated relationship with their family. And so I would not say that is more helpful from an outside perspective, while at the same time I understand that feeling existential loneliness is such a negative feeling that even being connected to things outside of your values, doing harmful, dangerous behaviors, feels like a better option. I can have empathy. I think I can have empathy and sympathy for that. I for sure have sympathy for it.
Do you think loneliness today is even more so now? And do you think in men there's more of a dependency to lean on groups, whether it's good or bad?
The word in your question that's making me hesitate is like more. There is way more loneliness, absolutely. And I think that has to do with boys' social worlds becoming more online. Like that is, it's a bit different for girls, even though girls are chronically online as well. It's that like the type of ways that boys are online can connect them on the social, on like the gaming world, on to other boys. And then I had some boys in my research who say like the only person they've ever opened up to about their lives is someone who lives like a couple thousand kilometers away, and they play Call of Duty together. And so it can be that, but a lot of the online worlds of boys disconnects them from face-to-face relationships. And we can look at society as well. It's like there is less hangouts in person after school than there was 20 years ago. Like the UK, my experience when I was in the UK was a bit different. I saw more roving groups of teenage boys like walking around the city together. I don't know if that's just a stereotype of what I saw.
There's definitely more of like boys going to the pub and having a drink. I think it's hard. That's the thing. It's definitely difficult to get groups of boys to be in a setting that doesn't revolve around going with your mates to the pub and having a drink, where things are a bit more, I don't know, there's more likely for a situation to happen where it's like things are to be laughed at or things to be passed off as a joke, but actually to have a real conversation with your mates in the park. I think there's more of that happening now. But yeah, I guess I feel like, is that you don't really get that often in where you are over on your side?
Don't get what too often?
Well, like just groups of guys that just hang out, not necessarily in a social drinking aspect, but actually like hanging out.
You do, especially more in certain areas. I'm kind of where I'm actually like currently located is like a more we're the horse capital of Canada, and so like there's things are a bit further away, and so it's like less likely to be walking around together unless you're kind of in a downtown hub. So it's kind of a bit more scattered. But there's also like just been a loss in like I don't want to say this in a fear-mongering way, but like the social fabric of like playing sports together, or just like community centers, or like when there was, and there's problems with this too, but like when there was just more third spaces for people to hang out, whether it was like a bowling alley in the 70s or 80s, there was less spaces where people can meet, and that is adding to the loneliness, like the fact that so much is going online, the online dating world, and just the messages that boys and girls are being inundated with on their cell phones. Like we see a huge mental health issues rising with the onset of when smartphones became ubiquitous in our pockets. Like it wasn't just the onset of the internet, it was specifically smartphones and social media with us at all times.
You did some research on Andrew Tate and why young men looking up to him as a role model. Why do you think that is?
Yes, I didn't do this research, but I talked about this research, is that some of the main ways or reasons why people, like 36% of teenage boys in Australia look up to him, 1 in 6 in America or the UK, maybe it's both, look up to him. Some of the main things that they say is that he's not afraid to speak his mind. So like, and humans are just attracted to confidence. And there's also some research that humans also tend to trust and are drawn to people with a British accent more. So like David Attenborough, we just like anything that he says, we hold that in more weight than a North American or an Australian.
He's got the voice for it as well, not just the accent.
Yes, absolutely. And so confidence, not afraid to say their minds, are some of the main draws. But the other thing of why people and boys and men are drawn towards those influencers like Andrew Tate is for self-improvement around their bodies. So like physical prowess, and like a symbol of financial success. And then like later on, then you get arguably the most problematic ones would be around the sexism and misogyny that Andrew Tate is very vocal about. Like this shouldn't be controversial. Like Andrew Tate calls himself, he's a self-proclaimed misogynist and doesn't think that you could be a man in the world today without being sexist. So most boys aren't drawn because of those sexist beliefs. That's not what the research is showing. Are they eventually exposed to some of the more problematic beliefs? Yes.
And you mentioned a couple of things about him, that he's not afraid of speaking his mind out, because when this whole bubble exploded with Andrew Tate and everyone was searching about him, and I was listening to him, and I have to agree that I have to say that I agreed with a lot of stuff that he said around, especially being true to himself, exercising. Just there was definitely a few things that I said, yeah, he's got a point, and I didn't try to ignore him because of his views on women, because I guess like everyone, there are a few things that he's doing right, and that there's obviously a bunch of other things that he's not doing right. So yeah, my question would be: do you think there is anything positive about what he says, or is it should like because of his bad stuff or habits that he does, the good stuff should be ignored?
Yeah, I guess that's a very common question of like, can you separate the art from the artist? Um, can I find things on Andrew Tate that I would agree with, like certain quotes, and like I have extensively looked at all of this stuff, like absolutely, and I think that um, that's like important to recognize, especially if you ever want to talk and address influencers like Andrew Tate to boys, like to not come down with like such something that would increase their defensiveness, where like everything is just ridiculous. So, like, have you actually listened to everything? At the same time, I will just vehemently say that like I think in the case of Andrew Tate, that even if there's a percentage of statements that are fine, is that there is so many other influencers that are saying like the good things that he might say that encourage some discipline. Other influencers are saying that don't have the problematic things. And so like I think that his the dehumanization that he purports is worth not listening to his voice, in my opinion.
Yeah. You also talked about Scott Galloway as well. I've seen on one of your videos. Would you agree and disagree with his views about masculinity?
There's like he's been speaking a lot more about masculinity lately, and what I agree with the most is that we need to stop giving boys only messages on ways to not be. That we also need to have more positive, aspirational ways to be. Like I think from how humans form identities, it's way less powerful to form an identity around things you shouldn't do than like things that you should do or how you should be. And so I'm totally with Scott Galloway on that. And I just think that some of the things that he says, I'm totally on board with. Like men need community. Like we need to go out there. Absolutely. The thing I probably disagree with him most is just presenting things like there's one solution. Like for instance, yes, I love working out. I feel like it does, in a sense, it makes me feel more present, makes me feel more embodied, and that's something important for me. But I don't think every man has to work out in order to be masculine. Like I think health is an important aspect of that, but I also hold the position that like almost anything can be a medicine or a drug depending on your intent. And I think working out can absolutely be a more negative drug for like if we look at the rates of body dysmorphia, bigorexia, muscle dysmorphia, disordered eating, body image issues amongst boys, like that is a part of the equation to hold this tension. And so if you're just telling like boys you need to work out in order to be manly, that's kind of fueling the whole cycle. It's like I 100% think that physical fitness is an important aspect of well-being, but it's not the only important aspect of well-being.
Do you think is one of the pillars?
I think so. I teach a course on human development, and it's about like holistic learning. So like I think the best research shows that like you cannot separate these domains. We generally do. These are the domains that I think are the pillars: spiritual, emotional, social, physical, and cognitive. And these things are all connected though. And so like I would love to see a balance and integration between them. So for instance, one of my favorite studies is about how to motivate students more effectively. And so there's like fixed mindset. If you congratulate a student like, oh, you're such a good artist, that is like one of the worst things to say to them, because then their identity gets wrapped up in being an artist. And then if they fail at it, then it's like, oh, I'm not an artist anymore. So the second best thing to do is to say like, oh, I see you working really hard and you're developing this skill. So that's like the growth oriented compliment. But
Praising
what
the effort, right?
yeah, praising the effort, praising the process, that's more helpful. But then, surprisingly, what was even more effective than that was just giving them a high five and not saying anything. And it was just like, okay, like the actual act of a high five. And I used to play volleyball, and our coaches every time after a point, um, he was the national coach for Canada volleyball. He would just like make us have to high five above our waists, like to kind of greet each other above our waist, just because the change of our body posture of like if we're just doing low high fives, it's like it's a different energy that happens when it's like, okay, excitement, high five. And so all that to say, a complicated way I could have simplified it, is that like our body connection is connected to our emotional health, which is why working out does help a lot of people in their emotions, but it's not it's not a substitute for emotional intelligence either.
I wanted to ask as well about the term incel, because I feel like it's been thrown left and right nowadays. And in your own opinion, do you think it's just overused, or is not used enough? And what does an incel mean in today's in the day and age?
Yeah, I'm curious where you've I don't feel like I've heard it be overused, but I also haven't heard it being used much, like on the ground. Like I do work with teenagers fairly frequently, and it's like a term that they know. So like involuntary celibate. So like men or boys that want to be in a relationship but can't. And so I think that's definitely an accurate term for those in the incel community. And I would say like most terms, I would just imagine that it gets overused to describe people that aren't actually like in the incel camp. And I've read there's actually a book called Boy Mum, and she like connected with some incels to kind of understand them a bit more. And yeah, like I think there is some important nuance of like incels have such a high suicide rate. They're overrepresented by boys and men who are autistic or in the autistic community. And they so interesting that your name is triangle theory, because there's something I'm not sure if you're familiar with called the drama triangle, or I prefer the trauma triangle, where people get stuck in viewing people in rigid roles as villains, victims, and heroes. And the whole goal is to get off of this trauma triangle. But I would say that incels at its core, like they both simultaneously view women as the villains responsible for their loneliness, and they also view women as heroes that they will save them from their loneliness. And we know in the research, like incels tend to overvalue the importance of looks and money, and they undervalue the importance of personality on romantic relationships. So I think incels is a very accurate and important term. But yeah, I'm actually, have you seen it overused, do you think?
Well, I feel like it's been used from again, it's not based on any research, but I feel like it's been used from girls more onto girls. They're like, if you, let's just say, if you don't have friends, you're an incel. If you can't talk to girls, you're an incel. And I feel like it became a bit more like an offensive word almost.
I think it's absolutely being used, you know, I think it sometimes it's being used accurately, and also I would not be surprised if it's being used as a way to insult people. Just like the same way that simp was. So when I did my research, simp was probably it was much more common. And I was talking to these boys who were getting made fun of for being simps, and they were talking to me about how confused they were, because they're like, I just thought I was being respectful to the girls in my life, but like and in this case, it was mostly guys calling them simp. But I do think that with what you're saying with incels, I am familiar with like some online exchanges where girls are referring to guys as incels, as insults, whether that's accurate or not. And so, like, yeah, I had multiple boys that would like felt like, oh, I'm in this tough space where like I want to be respectful, and yet I'm getting made fun of, and so like maybe I'm being a simp, and they were like genuinely confused about what it was. So I think sometimes these terms get weaponized, and now simp is almost like I've like language changes and the meaning changes, and so simp is almost like less. I don't know if you've experienced this in the UK, but I feel like it's more of a joke now than a serious insult hurled at people.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I do agree with that. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, what do you feel society expects of men that you believe is outdated?
Great question. One of the main ones would definitely be around like the two main mixed messages or the double binds that boys find themselves in is like around being a protector and provider, is that if you look across cultural examinations of what male role is to be, that most countries have two things in common: men as protectors and men as providers. And the way that we still mean this in your country and my country is generally like physical protection and financial provision. And I would be lying. Like, yes, I think that narrative is changing, and there's lots of society that's trying to be like, I'm trying to be like, instead of just physical protection, can you provide emotional protection, like for the people? Can you provide emotional safety for yourself and for others? Can you expand those definitions? Then I would be in that camp. But I would be lying if there wasn't still significant aspects of society that like want men to be physically burly and emotionally stoic, but not in the good way, in the suppressive way. Like they don't want to hear about men's problems. There's still a critical mass of that as well. I think sometimes some people, I think, believe that is overblown. Or let me say it another way. I do think that I'm against the opinion that like there's a lot of society that does want men to open up, but there's also a bunch of society that actually doesn't want or isn't ready for it. Like there's biases of like when any gender like sees a man crying, they're more likely to judge that harshly. So there's like work for all aspects of society to assess our biases, just like men 100% should be assessing our biases with the LGBTQ community, with women. But also women need to be assessing their biases of like, oh, how would it be if a man in your life expressed vulnerable emotions? Like, would you see that as weakness? Or if he didn't make as much money as you, I do think that a lot of guys are actually more insecure about that. But there is also a contingent of women that 100% want the guy to make more money than them. So there's mixed messages, absolutely, that boys face. And I'd say that those are the two main ones around provision and providing. Around providing and protection.
Yeah, it's hard, and, putting people in those, how people view those roles and where they also see themselves in those roles. So I feel like there needs to be a huge awareness and understanding, I suppose, more education on that in general.
And here's the thing though, like back to why boys like Andrew Tate is primarily around confidence, is that my encouragement for boys and men, it's like having the confidence to be the person that you want to be, regardless of if society is okay with it or not, is actually going to be more attractive. So we're talking about like wanting to find a partner. It's like if you think that the women in your life don't actually want that, that may not be the case, or maybe they can learn and grow that way. So like don't not be emotionally expressive just because you perceive that society isn't ready for that. Just like I would encourage you to actually to show up confidently and just be connected to your emotions in the way that feels authentic, or learn and grow in that area rather than just blaming society. Like we're all connected, right? Like we're all connected to this. Like it's not like society is the end all be all to how we can be individually, and it requires us to individually shift society as well.
You mentioned about connecting to your own emotions and being authentic. We spoke a few times on this podcast about how to be your authentic self, but what, like, I'm just interested to hear from your perspective. What do you mean by being authentic? Because the reason I'm asking is because when I was like 21 years old, 22 years old, I was listening to these YouTube videos about successful people, and they said, "Oh, all you have to do if you want to be successful in life is to be yourself, to follow your own values, be true to yourself, and just do what feels right." But at that time, I didn't know what felt right, and I didn't know what are my values. I didn't even know what values mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how would you? Again, I guess it's specifically for younger boys. Like, how do they figure themselves out?
That is such an important question, Conrad. Thank you. One of the key words would be curiosity. That, like, how do you figure it out is less about landing on someone, but just being curious. And I would encourage men to be curious about if they've disconnected from parts of themselves. So, like, for instance, we've talked about the emotional disconnect, but in the boy crises, I'll be like, oh, did I disconnect from anger? Did I disconnect from sadness? Or like, what's my relationship with each emotion? And so, like, you could do something that I've done, and I encourage it, but like, I have done a journal, like kind of like a journal history on like kind of the core emotions, being like, what's my history with anger? Like, what messages did I hear about anger growing up? And just like reflecting on my relationship with anger. And I'm someone that was like a people pleaser growing up, and I'm a recovering people pleaser as well. And so, like, I would try to keep the peace in my family, and suppress my own anger, and realize, oh, I actually have a lot of resentment built up because of that. And so, like, that's one way to just get curious about your relationship with certain emotions. That, like, I think you're absolutely right in, like, the language around be your authentic self can just be so nebulous, and it doesn't actually work if you're disconnected from like what you were initially, like, because, like, for instance, if I told that to a bunch of teenagers who loved Andrew Tate, they're like, okay, well, my values are money, power, success, and this is the way. So, like, Andrew Tate is aligned with my values. And so, like, then it's like, okay, then you've just checkmated me at my own phrasing,
Yeah.
at the own game. And so I have a much more humanist view, which is just like, I have a very positive view of humanity and of humans. And so, like, if we can get connected to, like, or curious about the ways we've disconnected, like how all children, like, they want to be connected to their community, to their caregivers, or I think like an access point for working with boys and men is specifically asking them about their relationship with their fathers, and like what kind of, so many boys also like want families and want future kids, and I see those as entry points of like softening, because it kind of connects them with their inner child, so to speak, and it connects them with, like, okay, what kind of kids and what kind of values do I want for them? And it kind of gets them outside of where they might currently be, but gets the chance to see, like, oh yeah, these were the values, or these mattered to me. This is the ways I've been emotionally disconnected and spiritually disconnected. And so, like, I think this is an ongoing process. But you have identified one of the main challenges or the difficulties if, like, we are not connected to ourselves. Or do you know the analogy of alpha wolves?
No.
Like, you've heard like the alpha male, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
And do you know like the research behind that's based off of?
No, not really.
Okay, so like here is gonna uh, allow me to just go down this path, and at the end I'll show like these are the two different paradigm shifts that we're fighting against. So the alpha male myth came from a guy named Robert Munch, or no, not Robert Munch. That's a Canadian poet. Um, Meach, David Meach is his name, and he has spent the rest of his career basically trying to disprove his theory of alpha males that he came up with, because he came up with the alpha and beta wolves, but there was one major flaw to his research, in that he only studied wolves in captivity, and wolves in the wild do not have alpha and betas. Like, it's not dominance based, in the sense that when there's a time of food scarcity in the wild, that the omega, the leaders of the pack, will actually give food to the youngest first and save food for themselves. So it's very much more altruistic. It's much more community driven than the alpha beta thing, which does happen in cages. And so here is probably one of the core fundamental beliefs I have with Andrew Tate. And I understand, I think I might have actually been a bit more in his camp of what he says here, but like he says, and I'm paraphrasing this quote, but it's pretty close to it. He said, the masculine life is a war. It's a war for the people for the woman that you want, the money that you want, the career that you want. And if you aren't viewing it as a war, then you're losing. I do not view life and relationships as a war. I understand that there's struggles, and there is like a sense that there's like, I can understand that language of like, there's a war inside me. I can understand that. But like, I think that if you are going to only view life as a war, then you're in that alpha and beta, you're in that captivity cage, which like, and then your values kind of make sense if that's your position of how you view the world. But the world that I want to live in is like wolves in nature, in harmony, and how those kind of wolves interact. And so like my paradigm is going to be so different from the cage. And so I can have understanding, especially when I work with youth that are deemed at risk and in gangs and involvement. Like, they have grown up, and I'm making a square here. They have grown up in a cage where that cage and surviving in that cage was advantageous. If they grew up in like abusive households or things like that, and you don't have to just have grown up in an abusive household, but like there's a lot of reasons why people view the world as like, you know what, the cage is real. And I'm not denying that cages exist in how boys and men in the society operates. But I just don't want to make my decisions and my values based on a life in a cage, so to speak.
Is that
I don't
why
know
it's
if
really?
I connected all of that.
Yeah, really well. I just is that why it's really important to go back to those disconnects in order to sort of find those values and understandings about yourself, so you can sort of break through that cage to learn about who that authentic self is.
Yeah, and I don't think I actually fell into the trap of when I was like, oh, it's all about my authentic self, and I was like, I'm either authentic or I'm not, and that was kind of like its own cage of like, I put so much pressure on myself to either be authentic or not authentic, and that was just like another way to judge myself and feel shame. And so I think psychology shows that like some of the healthiest individuals are people who are able to hold multiple truths at the same time, to hold multiple perspectives, to hold cognitive dissonance. Like, for instance, one of my best mates from Armadale, I think is the town in Scotland. He unfortunately died in an accident a couple of years ago, but he was researching violence against children, and he grew up with tons of fights. And he's like, I'm a pacifist now, and I'm doing research about this, but I would be lying to you if I didn't like sometimes feel like I just wanted to talk about all the fights I was in and how well I beat up those other guys. Like, he was just like not fighting that tension of like, yeah, I am full of contradictions, and he was at peace with that. And I think that we would be better if we were aware of our contradictions. And once again, I do not like, I am very against Andrew Tate, but I'm going to sound like I'm on his side. But like Andrew Tate, for all of his flaws, which are super harmful, he is, I would say he's owning his disconnection, and he's treating that as his core self, which I don't think is the case. I like to think that there's, this will sound lame to some, but like I think there's an inner Andrew Tate, a younger child Andrew Tate, that is not aligned with a lot of the things that he says, but he's not duplicitous in what he says. And so many young men, so many people are turned off from hypocrisy, and at the very least, Andrew Tate doesn't seem to be a hypocrite in his values and his actions.
Adolescence. You said that when the Prime Minister Keir decided to show adolescents in schools in the UK, you disagreed with that. Why is that?
I think that would just, I know, I'm very confident that that would just create more backlash, because the benefit of this show, Adolescence, is more for parents or educators. Like, I think there's a number of people that like, yeah, you should watch that show because some of the stuff that they're talking about there is very real and a reality in the schools that I'm working with. But then there's other people that need to like, whoa, take a step back. Don't be so fear-based around everything. Some things need to be taken with a grain of salt around that. It's not a documentary, although the red-pilled aspects of these dynamics are worth exploring and getting to know. But if you were to show that into schools, like one time I went to a school and talked about Andrew Tate, and as soon as I just mentioned his name, that wasn't the focus of my talk. I just had a gymnasium of grade 8 boys just yelling top G, top G, top G.
What color is your Bugatti?
Yeah. And then it was interesting though, afterwards there was like a group of like 5 boys that came up to me in like hushed tones and were like, so like, what do you actually think about Andrew Tate? And like, there were some of the boys that were yelling his name out the loudest. Like, they want to talk about these things. But I think that I think in the UK, there was like a minister who's like, we got to get this into every school. And I'm like, that's a very reactionary response. And reactionary responses are probably going to actually fuel the I don't like the term manosphere because I think it's too broad, but like the red pill movement that already thinks that society is villainizing boys and men. I think showing that is going to actually add further fuel to that argument.
Could you just describe the red pill and blue pill movement? Because I tried to look into that, and every time I read it, I get confused because, just if you could just describe that, please.
Yeah, so it's based on the metaphor from the Matrix of like, you take the blue pill, you stay asleep, you take the red pill, then you wake up to the reality that you're living in the Matrix. And one of the main beliefs of the red pill is like, oh, you have become... It's interesting that the red pill is like, essentially, they're trying to use it in the same way as like woke, of like you're becoming awake, but they have opposite intents or opposite conclusions. And so red pill is that you're becoming awake to how gender dynamics actually function in society, and that gender equality efforts have gone too far, and that women actually have more power than men, and men are the main victims in society today. And so that's like one element of the red pill. Another element of it as well is having like, ultimately, like, women still care about power and money, and so it's about like looks maxing. What is it called with your is it mewing? Are you familiar with that?
Mewing?
Mewing.
No,
It's like an exercise you can do with your tongue to try and make your cheekbones more chiseled and square. So like looks maxing is an element of red pill movement. And then you also have the black pill movement, which is more nihilistic, which is almost ubiquitous with incels. So you have like the black pill would be like, oh, I'm still not even physically strong enough, muscular enough, good looking enough, or financially successful enough to operate in this world. And so now it's kind of more given up and become
So
nihilistic about it.
victimizing ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Like this goes back to the trauma triangle of like, this is where I see gender relations getting so stuck in our society about like fighting over. There are real victims and there are real villains, but I'm saying like the mentality of getting stuck in like I'm the victim here, you're the villain. Like no, I'm the victim, you're the villain. Like we're just like jumping around the trauma triangle and no one is getting off of it, or society is having a really hard time getting off of it, so that people can actually be seen and witnessed in their pain. Like think about Men's Mental Health Month, which is when we're talking about this, is so often these topics get weaponized where it's like, oh, you don't care about men's mental health? Well, then like, F you, I'm going to dehumanize you in this other way. And then there's the opposite where men's, like I talk about this like suffering contest where like I saw, have you seen the video where this one woman on TikTok was dancing, kind of making fun of men's mental health?
No, I don't have TikTok, so
Oh,
probably.
okay. Yeah, that was all that to say, and maybe I'll summarize it here because this is getting too long-winded. But like, I don't think our society does a great job at showing up and holding space for anyone's pain, for girls and women's pain, for boys and men's pain, for gender expansive folk. Like I think we might be aware about it or we talk about it, but like people aren't actually really seen and held in their pain, and that kind of just fuels more polarization, because one of the things that prevents people from being angry is making them feel seen and heard and listened to. And so everyone's kind of competing to feel heard and seen and listened to, and at the same time no one's actually feeling seen and heard and listened to. And this is just fueling so much of the polarizations around gender dynamics today.
Interesting. What did you learn when you became a dad about yourself?
I learned that I thought I could prevent my children from experiencing any shame in their life, because I have come to realize that shame was probably one of the most key emotions that shaped how I have made decisions in my life. Even though when my wife met me, and she was a therapist, like one of our first 3 dates, she asked me, she's like, what's your relationship like with shame? And I told her, I don't think I've ever experienced shame in my life. I've been embarrassed, but I don't think I've ever experienced shame. Joke's on me. It's like shame has been such a motivate, like in my religious upbringing, shame was a huge part of my relationship with my body, all these other things. And so I was like, oh, great. I know this now. I'm not going to add to my children's shame. And it's like, oh man, that anytime I feel like I've landed or I've figured it out as a parent, I'm in for a surprise of like, oh, it's ongoing. It's like, oh, one of my kids experiences shame to a much higher degree than I ever thought possible. And so it's like, I need to be extra cautious or like extra attuned just because I didn't experience this as shame when I was a kid. I need to respond to the child in front of me. And so that's one of the things I've learned. Another thing that I've learned is just how much feelings feel. Like I was like, oh, it's like made me realize that some of the stories I had as a kid that I've like told as funny jokes to people, of like the time where my parents forced me to give away one of my favorite dinosaur toys to a random person because I had 2 of them. But like, oh, I'm actually kind of pissed about that because I had two of them for a reason. And I would play with them in two, and they forced me to give it away. And I just like my boundary. I'm angry about that, and it feels weird as an adult to be like, I'm still angry about something that happened when I was 5 years old. But children give me the opportunity to look in the mirror, and that catalyzes my own healing.
Beautiful. I remember you mentioned, I saw it on YouTube. I'm not sure now, but I saw when you told a story where when you were studying in Edinburgh, this guy was very negative about stuff about the day, and then you offered him to give a hug, and then the whole class gave him hugs. Why do you think that was such a shift in his in his emotions, I guess? And if you don't mind, just telling the story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my best friends, he was the friend I talked about earlier, who's since passed away. He came into the office in Edinburgh just like crabby about everything going wrong his day. And it wasn't like, I would have responded differently if he was like, if it was a serious issue he was upset about. But he was just kind of like pouty about things. And I finally turned around and I was like, Stuart, do you need a hug? And I think it just caught him so off guard that he didn't know what to do. He often said, like, my influence in his life, he's like, I've never met a man like me. He's like, in Scotland, obviously this is a stereotype. He's like, in Scotland, guys aren't gonna just give a hug or like offer that up, or that he's never at least experienced that. And so he kind of was just like, okay, maybe. And then there was only other women in my office at that time. And they're like, yeah, Stuart, let's give you a hug. And so they all lined up and gave him a hug. And then as they're hugging, I'm like, it has to be 20 seconds at least, because that's when like oxytocin levels change. And that's like actually a physiological difference in decreasing stress. And so they all gave him 20-second hugs. And then there was this moment between me and him after all 5 other colleagues had given him hugs, where it was like, even though it was my idea, are we still going to hug? Because it's kind of weird for us to hug. But we ended up going for it. And he was just like giddy the whole rest of the day. So, and like just in the way that like he's just like, this has changed. Like I feel so different. And I think that just speaks to the importance of community and connection, and how our bodies, like physiologically, are impacted by regulating with other bodies. Like you might have heard the expression before, or the saying that we are a combination of our 5 closest friends.
Yeah.
And I've also since heard something else I quite like, is that our nervous system is a combination of our 5 closest friends. Our 5 closest friends is nervous systems. So like our nervous systems are constantly being impacted by each other as well. And so just to feel cared for and connected and loved in a way that was disarming, I think that was what was powerful about that hug. And it was powerful for all of us as well. Like oxytocin is released more. It's a bonding hormone. Maybe we all bonded after that more too.
Beautiful. Just one more question as well. I know that like the suicide rates amongst men just skyrocketing every year, and I feel like there is no right way to bring awareness about it. Like talking about it, there is one, but and it's quite contradictory to what I do, because I post on LinkedIn every single day about men's mental health, and I'm trying to bring awareness, and that's what we try to do with this podcast as well. But I feel like talking about it itself is not enough. And at times I'm thinking, is it even a good thing to talk about it when it just comes from everywhere?
Awareness is always the first step. Sorry, not always. That's a bit too definitive. But often in healing, awareness is like a really important step. To be aware of your disconnections, to be aware of your emotions, to be aware of biases, to be aware of patterns. So being aware is really important, but absolutely in agreement that there is more collective awareness about men's mental health in recent years. But like now we need to move to a next stage, which has more on the ground support. Like, how does this practically shift? What kind of structures are in place to support men's mental health? What kind of activities can we do? There's like a charity in the UK called the Human Space. And they basically have like an Alcohol Anonymous group, but it's for men just to talk about their emotions and feelings. So like, that's just a space, a weekly or bi-weekly space that people can do. Like, that is actually doing something rather than just talking about it. Like, it requires a level of discomfort because it's easy to talk about an issue. And then the next step is like, oh, now I actually have to have conversations with men about their mental health. Or there's a great researcher, Zach Seidler, who's in charge of Movember in Australia. And he's always talking about like different ways to engage men in therapy rather than just talk therapy. Like, can we go for a hike? Can we play table tennis while we're having these conversations? Like, when my best friend died, it was with one of the most healing experiences for me was playing badminton with another guy in the UK who lived in the flat above me. And he was a vet from Afghanistan. And we hardly ever talked about my friend's death. There was just a couple times, but it was just like being close and someone who consistently badminton or tennis twice a week. Like, that was so important for my mental health. So that like requires all of us to do what we can in our own communities. And that is less flashy, but more important than just awareness.
Is it a case of just providing the space to be heard?
That is definitely a component of it. But at the same time, that's targeting the people that will actually take that space to be heard. Like, I think we all have the best influence in our own circles. So like, it's one of those things where I've heard like, I've created this podcast, but are my actual friends even engaging or liking my posts about it to support me? I think sometimes we overlook just like our direct community of like, have I checked in with my male friends? Have I checked in? Like, it was just Father's Day. My male friend who is estranged from his father, whose father passed away, did I check in on him, ask him how he's doing? Even if you get no response back in return, like, a lot of boys and men like really appreciate those reach outs, even if they almost are stuck in knowing how to respond.
Beautiful. Well, Brendan, that was great. It flew by, hour and 30 minutes, but it definitely just flew by. Where can people find more about what you do, your work, and everything about you?
Everything right now is on my website, remasculine.com. I'm most active on Instagram right now. But yeah, thanks so much for having me. And there's so many different conversations or different components that we got a chance to talk about. But I appreciate the conversations you're having.
Thank you so much.